Beloved voices in Hollywood rarely tremble. But in those first quiet seconds, you can hear John Travolta's breath crack as he whispers that some truths were never meant to stay buried, and that the weight of one man's silence nearly destroyed his soul. The room is dim, lit only by a small lamp that throws long shadows across the photographs lining his wall, frozen moments of laughter with people who are no longer here, moments that still feel alive to him even now. At 71, John Travolta sits alone with a single recorder between his hands, fingers shaking just enough to reveal the fear he has carried for decades. He does not look like the confident star who once danced across screens and red carpets. He looks like a man who has been waiting far too long to finally speak. Outside, the city hums with life, but inside this room, time feels heavy, as if every memory is pressing down on his chest, begging to be acknowledged. He begins by saying Rob Reiner's name softly, not with anger, but with a kind of wounded reverence, as though even now he is afraid to disturb whatever fragile truth still remains between them. John remembers the first time they met, back when Hollywood felt smaller and warmer, when dreams were still spoken out loud without shame. Rob was charming then, funny and brilliant, a man who could make a room fall silent with a single story. John had admired him, trusted him, and that trust had slowly grown into something deeper, something that felt like family. They shared long nights talking about films that never got made, about fears they never admitted to anyone else, about the way success can hollow you out if you let it. But somewhere along the way, something shifted, something that neither of them wanted to name. John's voice grows quieter as he admits that the change did not come with a single argument or betrayal, but with a series of small moments, glances that lingered too long, words that were never fully spoken, promises that were made and quietly broken. There were other people in those years, too, faces that the world knows well, men and women who pass through their lives like comets. John speaks of late dinners with Robin Williams where laughter barely masked the sadness underneath, of long phone calls with Carrie Fisher who understood what it meant to live with ghosts, of hushed conversations with Tom Hanks about the cost of always being loved by millions, but truly known by so few. All of them, in their own way, were circling the same pain, the same loneliness that fame could never fill. Rob was always there in the background of those memories, sometimes smiling, sometimes distant, sometimes so intense that it made John uncomfortable, even afraid. As the years passed, the secrets grew heavier. John's family felt it first. His wife would look at him with worry in her eyes, sensing a sadness she could not reach. His children would ask why he seemed so tired, why he was always lost in thought. He wanted to tell them everything, but he was bound by loyalty, by fear, by the unspoken rules of an industry that punishes vulnerability. There were nights when he would wake up drenched in sweat, hearing Rob's voice in his dreams, saying words that were never meant to be heard by anyone else. Those words still echo in his mind, not because they were cruel, but because they were filled with a desperate honesty that neither of them knew how to handle. Then came the illness, slow and unforgiving, creeping into Rob's life like a shadow. John describes the first phone call, the way Rob tried to sound strong even as his voice betrayed him. He wanted John there, needed him there, and despite everything, John went. He sat by Rob's bed in sterile hospital rooms, listening to machines beep while memories played like old films in his head. They talked about everything except the one thing that mattered most. They joked about the past, about movies and awards, and all the things that no longer seemed important. But beneath it all was a tension so thick John could feel in his bones. One night, when the pain was too much and the walls felt too close, Rob finally broke. His eyes, once so full of fire, were now clouded with fear and regret. He told John that there were things he wished he had said differently, choices he wished he had made with more courage. He reached for John's hand, holding it with a trembling grip that felt like both an apology and a plea. John's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might stop, because he knew that whatever was about to be said could change everything. But before Rob could finish, a nurse walked in. The moment shattered, and the truth slipped back into silence. Rob never got another chance. Those were his last, almost words, a confession that hovered in the air but was never fully born. John has lived with that unfinished sentence ever since, a wound that never healed. He watched Rob fade, surrounded by machines and whispered prayers, feeling powerless to save him from the one thing that mattered most, his own unspoken truth. After the funeral, Hollywood moved on as it always does, but John did not. He carried Rob's secrets like a heavy stone in his chest, wondering if he had failed him by not demanding the truth when it still mattered. Now, decades later, John finally lets the tears fall. He speaks of the nights he spent alone, replaying every conversation, every look, every mischance. He speaks of the guilt that gnawed at him, of the fear that if he ever told this story, he would betray a man he once loved in his own complicated way. But he also knows that silence has its own kind of cruelty, that some truths demand to be heard, no matter how painful they are. His voice grows steadier as he admits that what Rob left behind was not just a legacy of films, but a trail of unanswered questions that only he can now begin to reveal. The recorder hums softly as John takes a deep breath, gathering the courage to go deeper into a story he's kept locked away for far too long, a story of love, regret, and a truth that still waits in the shadows, ready to finally be brought into the light. The silence after that first confession feels almost sacred, as if even. The walls are listening, and John Travolta's eyes drift toward the window where the faint glow of the city blurs into 1,000 tiny lights that remind him of every soul he has lost along the way. He says that after Rob was gone, something inside him broke open, a dam of memories that he had tried for years to hold back. Suddenly, he was reliving moments he had buried so deeply he almost believed they never happened, moments that were now demanding to be seen. There were late-night drives with Rob through empty Los Angeles streets, when the world felt so quiet that even their breathing sounded loud. And Rob would talk about his fears of being forgotten, of being misunderstood, of never being able to show the world who he truly was. John would listen, offering comfort, never realizing that those words were not just fears, but warnings. He admits now that he was afraid of how close they had become. In Hollywood, closeness can be dangerous because it exposes the parts of you that no spotlight should ever touch. Rob had a way of looking at him that made John feel both seen and exposed, a look that carried warmth but also an aching longing that neither of them dared to name. There were nights when they sat on opposite ends of a couch, talking about nothing, yet the air between them felt electric, filled with things that should never be said but somehow always were, just in different forms. John remembers thinking that if he ever let that moment go too far, it would change everything, and he was not sure he was brave enough for that. Other stars sensed it too, even if they never spoke of it. Meryl Streep once teased him gently about how often Rob's name came up in conversation, and Jack Nicholson gave him a knowing smile that made his stomach twist. In an industry where secrets are traded like currency, everyone seemed to understand there was something unspoken between them. But John kept telling himself it was nothing, that it was just the closeness of two artists who shared a bond, until the day Rob called him late at night, his voice shaking, telling him he felt like he was running out of time. He didn't mean his illness then. He meant his life, his chance to finally be honest about who he was. That night, Rob told John he was tired of pretending, tired of playing a role, even off camera. He said there were things he wanted to tell him, things he had wanted to say for years, but never found the courage. John remembers sitting in his kitchen, the clock ticking loudly, his heart pounding as if it already knew what was coming. He wanted to tell Rob to stop, to protect both of them from whatever truth was about to spill out, but he also wanted to hear it more than anything. And then, just like so many MES before, Rob laughed it off, turning the moment into a joke, and the truth retreated once again into the shadows. The weight of that unfinished honesty followed John everywhere. It crept into his marriage, into his performances, into the way he looked at himself in the mirror. He began to wonder if he was living a life built on half-truths, if by protecting Rob's secret, he was also betraying his own. His wife would ask why he seemed distant, why he would stare into space as if listening to someone who wasn't there. He never told her that sometimes he could still hear Rob's voice, still feel the warmth of his hand on his, still sense the words that were never spoken pressing against his heart. When Rob's illness finally became impossible to ignore, everything grew more urgent. Hospital visits replaced movie sets, and the smell of disinfectant replaced the glamour of Hollywood. Rob looked smaller, weaker, but his eyes still held that same intensity that had always drawn John in. They talked about the past, about films they loved, about people they had lost, like Philip Seymour Hoffman and Heath Ledger, names that carried their own tragedies. It felt as though death was closing in from every side, and still the most important truth remained unspoken one evening. When Rob was in too much pain to pretend anymore, he told John that he regretted all the times he chose fear over honesty. He said there was one person he wished he had been braver with, one relationship he wished he had allowed to be real. John knew in his bones that he was that person, that whatever Rob was trying to say was meant for him. His chest tightened, his eyes burned, and for a moment it felt like the entire world had narrowed down to that hospital room. But once again, the words never came, and Rob closed his eyes, exhausted, leaving John alone with a truth that was still just out of reach. After Rob passed, John felt like he had lost more than a friend. He had lost a story that would never be fully told, a love that was never allowed to breathe, a truth that would forever haunt him. He carried that pain through the years, through red carpets and interviews, through smiles that hid a broken heart. And now, sitting alone with this recorder, he knows that telling this story is the only way he can finally honor what was left behind, even if it means opening wounds that may never truly heal. His voice trails off, heavy with memories that are only just beginning to surface, and the air feels thick with everything he still has yet to say that John's hands are still trembling as he continues. And he admits that for a long time after Rob was gone, he tried to drown the memories in work, in travel, in anything that would keep him from sitting alone with the ghosts of his past. But grief has a way of finding you no matter how far you run, and every quiet moment became a battlefield where Rob's face would appear, looking at him with that same mixture of hope and regret. He says there were days when he would be on set, surrounded by lights and cameras, and suddenly he would feel a wave of sadness so strong it made him dizzy, because he realized he was performing while the one person who truly knew him was no longer there to see it. He began to isolate himself, pulling away from friends who tried to reach out. Even people like Olivia Newton-John, who had shared so much of his life and understood his pain, could sense that there was something deeper he wasn't saying. She once told him that some wounds don't heal until you finally let the truth out, and her words haunted him because he knew how right she was. But the truth he carried was complicated, fragile, and tied to a man who was no longer here to tell his side of the story. John feared that by speaking, he might rewrite Rob's legacy in a way that felt unfair, or expose something Rob had spent his whole life trying to protect. Yet the silence was destroying him. He started having panic attacks, waking up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, his heart racing as if he were back in that hospital room all over again. He would replay Rob's almost confessions again and again, wondering what he would have said if the nurse hadn't walked in, if time had just given them a few more minutes. Those unanswered questions became a kind of illness of their own, eating away at John's peace, making him feel like he was slowly losing himself. One particularly dark night, he found himself sitting in his car outside Rob's old house, a place that had once been filled with laughter and now stood quiet and empty. He didn't know why he went there, only that something inside him needed to be close to whatever trace of Rob was left in the world. He sat there for hours, crying, talking out loud to a man who could no longer hear him, apologizing for all the things he never said, all the courage he never found. He admits that in that moment, he felt more alone than he ever had in his life. Even with all his fame and success at IT, was then that he realized how deeply Rob had shaped him. Not just as a filmmaker or a friend, but as someone who had forced him to confront parts of himself he had always been afraid to look at. Rob had seen through the charm, through the celebrity, straight into the heart of who John really was. And that kind of being seen is both a gift and a curse, because once someone knows you that deeply, losing them feels like losing a piece of your own soul. He speaks now of the guilt that followed him, the feeling that he had let Rob down by not pushing him to speak, by not giving him the safety he needed to be honest. He wonders if Rob might have found some peace before he died if he had been able to say what he was carrying inside. The thought that he might have played a part, even unintentionally, in Rob's silent suffering is something John says he will never fully forgive himself for. There were times when he tried to talk to other people about it, to test the waters, but every time he came close, fear would clamp down on his throat. Hollywood is not kind to complicated truths, and he worried that if he told this story, it would be twisted, sensationalized, turned into something ugly. He wanted Rob to be remembered for his brilliance, his kindness, his impact on cinema, not for a secret that he never chose to make public. And yet, he also knew that erasing that part of Rob was another kind of betrayal, one that denied the fullness of who he really was. So John stayed quiet, carrying the story alone, until it began to feel unbearable. He describes the way his health started to suffer, how stress and grief took a toll on his body, leaving him exhausted and fragile. Doctors told him he needed to find a way to release what he was holding inside, that emotional pain can be just as deadly as any physical illness. That was when he finally understood that telling this story was not just about Rob. It was about survival. His eyes fill with tears again as he admits that even now, he is afraid. Afraid of how people will react. Afraid of how Rob's family might feel. Afraid of what this truth might change. But he is more afraid of staying silent forever, of letting Rob's almost confession fade into nothing. The room feels heavy with everything he is finally daring to say, and the story, like a wound being reopened, is only just. There were nights when he would write letters to Rob that he never intended to send, pouring out everything he wished he had said. He wrote about how much he admired his courage and his talent, about how much he regretted not being braver when it mattered most. Those letters piled up in a drawer, silent witnesses to a love and a pain that could not be shared with the world. Sometimes he would read them back and feel as though Rob was right there with him, listening, forgiving, understanding that he also speaks of the toll it took on his family. His children grew up watching their father struggle with a sadness he could not explain, and it broke his heart to know that his silence was hurting them too. He wanted to be strong for them, to show them that even in loss, there is hope. But the truth he carried made it hard to breathe, let alone smile. There were moments when he worried that if he didn't find a way to release it, he might lose himself completely to it. Was only when he reached his 70s, when he began to feel his own mortality more sharply, that he realized how little time any of us really have. He thought about all the things Rob never got to say, all the chances he never got to take, and he promised himself that he would not make the same mistake. He decided that the story, as painful as it was, deserved to be told, not to create scandal, but to honor the complexity of a man who had meant so much to him as he speaks now. There's a quiet determination in his voice, a sense that he has crossed a point of no return. He knows that once these words leave his mouth, there's no taking them back. But he also knows that keeping them inside any longer would be a betrayal of everything he and Rob once shared. The truth, he says, is not always kind, but it is always necessary. The room feels charged with anticipation, as if the air itself is holding its breath. Why? Ting for him to finally reveal what Rob was never able to say out loud, and what he's been carrying in his heart for so very long. John's voice lowers now, almost to a whisper, as he begins to step closer to the heart of what he's been circling all this time. He says that in the final weeks of Rob's life, when the doctors had grown quiet and the nights had grown longer, Rob asked him to come alone. No cameras, no assistants, no family, just the two of them and the truth that had been waiting between them for years. John remembers walking into that room and feeling as though he were stepping into a confession booth, a place where lies could no longer survive. Rob looked at him with eyes that were no longer afraid, only tired. He told John that he was running out of time, that there was something he had carried in his heart for most of his life, and he could not leave this world without letting it be known. His voice shook as he said that the greatest tragedy of his life was not any failure or missed opportunity, but the fear that had kept him from loving openly, from choosing the one person who had made him feel truly understood. John's breath caught in his throat, because he knew exactly who Rob was talking about, even before his name was spoken. Rob told him that he had loved him in a way that went beyond friendship, beyond admiration, into something deeper and more terrifying. He said that being around John made him feel alive, seen, and whole, but also terrified, because he was afraid of what the world would do to them if that truth ever came out. He admitted that he had hidden behind humor and success, using them as shields to protect a heart that was aching to be honest. John says that hearing those words was both beautiful and devastating, because it confirmed everything he had felt but never dared to admit to himself. In that moment, all the years of silence and almost confession suddenly made sense. The glances, the tension, the words that always stopped just short of the truth, they were all part of a love that never found the courage to speak its own name. John wanted to tell Rob that he felt it too, that he had always felt it, but the weight of the world, of expectations, of fear, pressed down on him so heavily that he could barely speak. He held Rob's hand, tears streaming down his face, wishing he could go back and change every moment where he chose safety over honesty. Rob told him he didn't blame him, that he understood how impossible their situation had been. He said that all he wanted now was for John to remember him not as a secret, but as someone who had loved deeply, even if that love was never allowed to be lived out loud. Those were his true last words, spoken softly but with a clarity that cut through everything else. Shortly after, Rob fell asleep, and he never woke up again. John says that he left that room feeling as though a part of him had died too. He had finally heard the truth, but it came too late to change anything. For years, he carried that confession alone, afraid to let it be known, afraid of how it might reshape Rob's memory and his own. But he also carried it as something precious, a reminder that even in a life full of fear and regret, there had been a love that was real. Now, as he shares this for the first time, his voice breaks under the weight of it all. He is not trying to rewrite history or create a different story. He is simply telling the one that was never allowed to be told. The truth, he says, is messy and painful, but it is also the only way he knows to finally give Rob the dignity of being fully seen, even after death. The room is quiet again, thick with emotion and the echo of words that waited too long to be spoken. John, let's say. Long silence stretch after that confession, as if even he is unsure how to live inside the truth now that it has finally been spoken. He says that for years he tried to tell himself that what happened in that hospital room was just the imagination of a grieving man. That memory has a way of reshaping pain into stories that feel more bearable. But every time he closed his eyes, Rob was there again, not as a legend, not as a director, but as a fragile human being who had reached for him in his final hours and asked to be understood. Whether the world would ever accept that version of Rob no longer mattered, because to John, it was the one that felt the most real that he speaks of the complicated aftermath, of how carrying such an intimate truth about someone who could no longer speak for himself felt like both an honor and a curse. There were moments when he wanted to scream it from the rooftops, to tell everyone that Rob had been more than what they saw, that his heart had been bigger and braver than anyone ever knew. And there were other moments when he wanted to lock it away forever, to protect Rob from the harshness of a world that so often turns vulnerability into spectacle. That tension tore at him, leaving him restless and unsure of where loyalty truly lay. John describes how his own family became his anchor through all of this, even though they never fully knew why he was hurting so deeply. His children would hug him, sensing his sadness, and in their quiet love, he found the strength to keep going. He realized that if Rob had taught him anything, it was that hiding who you are comes at a terrible cost. He didn't want to pass that legacy of silence down to the people he loved most. There were days when he felt Rob close, as if his presence still lingered in the corners of his life. He would hear a familiar laugh in a crowd, or see a familiar gesture in a stranger. And for a moment it felt like Rob was still with him, reminding him not to waste what little time any of us have. Those moments were bittersweet, filled with both comfort and an ache that never quit. Now, sitting here and finally telling this story, John says he feels lighter and heavier all at once. Lighter because the secret no longer lives only inside him. Heavier because he knows that once a truth is shared, it takes on a life of its own. He does not claim to have all the answers, and he knows that memory and love can blur together in ways that make certainty impossible. But he also knows what he felt, what he heard, and how deeply it changed him. His voice softens as he speaks Rob's name one last time, not with sorrow, but with a quiet gratitude. Whatever their story truly was, however the world might choose to see it, it was something that gave him a glimpse of a love that was honest, even if it was never allowed to be lived openly. And in that, there is a kind of tragic beauty that he will carry with him for the rest of his life. The room falls silent again, filled with the weight of everything that has finally been set free, and John sits there, breathing slowly, as if learning how to live in a world where the truth no longer has to hide. John does not smile as he reaches the end of his story, but there is a softness in his eyes that was not there before, a kind of peace that only comes after a long war with your own heart. He says that telling this truth does not bring Rob back. It does not rewrite the years they lost or the words that were never spoken. But it does something just as important. It lets Rob finally exist as he truly was, not just as a legend, but as a man who loved and was afraid and hoped for something more. In that way, this confession is not an ending. It is a beginning, a chance for Rob's spirit to be seen without the mask that Hollywood so often forces people to wear, that he admits that there are still nights when he wakes up and reaches for a phone that will never ring, moments when he wants to hear Rob's voice one more time, even if it's only to argue about some forgotten scene or laugh about some old joke. But now those memories feel gentler, less like wounds and more like echoes of something beautiful that once existed. The pain is still there, but it no longer feels like a punishment. It feels like proof that what they shared mattered. John says he hopes that anyone listening who has ever been afraid to tell their truth will find a little courage in this story. Not because it is easy, but because living in silence can slowly destroy even the strongest heart. Rob's greatest regret was not that he loved, but that he waited too long to let himself be known. And that is a lesson John carries with him every day. He does not know how the world will judge this confession, but he knows that he could not keep living with it locked inside. As the recorder clicks off, there is no dramatic music, no grand gesture, just a quiet man sitting in a dim room, finally at peace with the memories that once haunted him. Outside, the city keeps moving, unaware of the truth that has just been spoken. But inside, something has shifted forever. Rob Reiner is no longer just a name in a film credit or a face in a photograph. He is a heart that loved, a soul that longed, and a story that, at last, has been told.